I want to offer a quick trigger warning. We want everybody to find what is useful here, but this is, in fact, a podcast about trauma.
This is informational. It's for you and your homies to use and help yourself get well. It should be supplemental, but not in place of whatever healing modalities you're already engaged in. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Leslie.
And I'm Teddy.
We believe that there should be universal access to healing. We're doing a podcast because we believe it's part of the way for us to get there.
So welcome to the podcast that says that we all, without exception, can be whole again. And the only pod that comes with a prescription for ice cream. Today, I'm thinking mango sorbet. Each episode of this season will explore one of the 5 statements that make up the integrative healing and trauma framework, what we'll just refer to on the podcast as the framework. We'll share the general theory, examples from our work to stitch it together, and stories to bring it to life. On today's episode, you'll get to meet the creators and dive into the first statement a bit. You can find show notes and more information at wholeagainpod.com. So let's get with the introductions. Like I said, I'm Teddy. I was born in upstate New York, in the Hudson Valley, the lands that the Esopus and Iroquois have been stewarding for generations and generations. I'm also a politicized healer, a book DJ, an aspiring tea farmer, a small business owner, the youngest of 3 and father of 2. I've been a social worker and social work professor, an outdoor educator and classroom teacher, a camp counselor, and most recently directed a trauma-informed schools project in Bulbancha, also known as New Orleans, called the Coalition for Compassionate Schools. And currently, most of my days are filled doing facilitation work, working with individuals and organizations who are shaping social change.
So my name is Leslie Briner, and I was born and mostly raised in the California Bay Area, specifically on the indigenous land of the Ohlone. I've been a social worker and educator now for almost 25 years. I've seen some things, many things, including a lot of trauma that early on I didn't have any framework to understand, in part because it didn't fit into narrow definitions that I was offered in school. I saw how individuals harmed kids, but so did systems and the culture at large. And I saw how the harm these youth experienced in groups seemed to have its own quality, as did the social stigma that they experienced. It just all had its own somewhat unique vibe. In 2008, Teddy and I met in graduate school in Seattle at the University of Washington School of Social Work. We became friends and stirred up some stuff at the school. And through our collaboration and friendship over the last 15 years, what we've come to understand is that the definitions of trauma that we were offered are not necessarily wrong, although there may be some more wrong than others, but we have a strong sense that they are quite certainly incomplete. And our goal here is to get whole again. There are many layered stories and concepts that stitch this framework together, and I want to start with just one small but significant piece of that story. It's about 10 years ago. It is springtime. Teddy and I are taking a walk in a local park. And as we talked, it kind of emerged that we'd both been thinking a lot about trauma and healing, but from different angles. I'd been thinking about how trauma occurs at these different levels, what we'll call now layers, in part to try to understand the ways I saw trauma impacts in groups and systems, behaving and showing up differently than it did with individuals. And Teddy had been thinking a lot about body-based impacts of trauma and the ways that trauma overwhelms our bodies. And the more we talked, the more we recognized that they weren't different lenses per se, but rather parts of a whole. It was, to put a very fine point on it, one of many pivotal points of integration. In the moment, as it happened, it was just one of those cool shared aha moments. We had a little collective effervescence. Then we joked about writing a book. And towards the end of our walk, Teddy said, "It's like everyone should just have universal access to healing." A statement which stopped me in my tracks. And I have thought about it in some way every day since then. I joked and I said, "Wow, universal access to healing. That's amazing. And it's definitely what we should name the book." To which Teddy replied, 10 years ago, "Or the podcast." So that's the start of the through line to the podcast you're listening to right now. We knew these ideas could help people who've experienced trauma and the folks who love them. So entirely as a side project to our existing work, we began to develop this framework with a deep hope and intention to offer it to the world when we felt like it was ready.
And so here we are, 2 folks who are usually in front of or sitting with groups of people offering this framework as a way to help them with their own healing or organizational change. And instead, we're sitting in front of microphones, talking to each other, staring at a big screen, hoping there are a bunch of y'all out here who will tune in and find something useful here. Because fundamentally, we come to this work as practitioners, right? So our approach to theory building is that it needs to be understandable, applicable, and responsive to people's lived lives, specifically the lives of trauma survivors and those who love them. And that's to whom we dedicate this podcast. If the framework benefits others, great, that's a bonus, but we're clear about who it's for and why we built this model. Before we share the framework in its entirety, there's one more part of the story that we want to layer in, and that's the story of a really tragic year in the Seattle public school system. It was at an alternative school in Seattle, and they had lost 6 students to suicide or homicide over the first semester of the year. And like schools do, they did the thing. They called in the grief counselors and the social workers and the whomevers to come and deal with it each time it happened. But by this time, the principal was really trying to find a different solution, and so cast a wider net. And that's when Leslie and I got called in. My kid's future pediatrician was called in, right? It was a much wider group of people coming to say, what is the thing that's happening here? And how do we tend to these kids who are right here, right now? One of the ways that we came to the 4 fundamentals that we talk about was through this work. It was heavily influenced by the work of generative somatics, which I was studying at the time. But so much of what we came to was about finding ways of getting at how are we taking care of and tending to these young people in a way that isn't missing the big picture. And so to paraphrase the words of the late, great Toni Morrison, having not found the theory that we wanted to read, we wrote it. Like Leslie said, we've been carrying it around for over 10 years, tinkering and refining. But here's what we arrived at. We begin whole. Our birthright includes safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, fundamental needs of all beings. That we embody trauma and healing across 5 domains: individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and historical. That trauma interrupts. That trauma, in fact, is the harmful interruption and disintegration of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. That trauma overwhelms. That is experienced throughout the body-brain, overwhelming our ability to cope with and integrate thoughts, sensations, and emotions that are connected to an experience. And finally, that we can be whole again. That pathways or doorways to healing occur anytime we do anything that restores or promotes our safety, agency, dignity, or belonging, and moves bodies toward wholeness and integration. It's simple, right? If that's all you need, you can turn it off and go get your life. But if you want to dip into the details, stick around a while. Leslie's going to tell us what we're going to get into today.
So today's episode focuses on the first statement of the framework. We begin whole. Our birthright includes safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, fundamental needs of all beings. So we're going to talk first about wholeness, and then those fundamental needs of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, as well as explore how this framework relates to and expands on existing definitions of trauma. It is an ambitious agenda, but hey, this is our first podcast episode.
Whoop, whoop.
This concept of wholeness is at the open and the close of the framework very, very much on purpose. We start with beginning whole, and we end with the belief, the premise, promise, that we can be whole again. This provides a guidepost towards what it means to be whole, and that we can have our fundamentals of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging restored and intact. When we say we begin whole, we also mean that we have access to a full range of emotions, sensations, and experiences. Part of the response to trauma is a flattening of our emotions, sensations, and experiences. Our range for what is possible becomes narrow and constricted and tight and rigid. And this is a response to both ourselves repressing things internally, like when we numb our feelings or block out a memory, as well as being repressed or threatened by other people or systems causing us harm. Humans are by nature emotional and expressive beings. So if we're compressing these emotions and experiences, it must be really important for our survival in order for it to be something that we do regularly and in some cases automatically. So there is so much more to say on this whole issue. This is just planting a seed. But perhaps think about this concept of wholeness as a way to check in. How are my safety, agency, dignity, and belonging in this moment? Or this week? Or another thing you can think about is, can you look in a mirror and just simply say to yourself out loud, I am worthy of love and belonging and the care and safety of the collective.
I love it every time. I am worthy of care and belonging. The seed of this piece was planted when I was taking a class with Dr. Karina Walters, an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation, when we were at the School of Social Work together. And even though we were studying historical trauma, specifically in Native communities, and the impact of that trauma across generations, there was this really crucial admonition not to begin with harm. One of the ways that she would talk about historical trauma was essentially that it was an interruption or a severing of the tribe from its original instructions. And so even though we were studying historical trauma, she wanted to make sure that we understood it was an interruption of something whole that had existed prior to colonization. That seed wouldn't flower or fruit until about a decade later, but just as we recognize that there exists a time before harm, we have to tell the story of where these seeds come from. And doing work around trauma, there is often an emphasis on harm as the center of the story, and often as the whole story. And within the framework, we make sure that it's not the whole story. There's a before and an after. When we started out, we even called it the integrative trauma framework, which almost became the name of the pod. Shout out to Kirsten, my business partner, for giving us something better than that. But after a few years of working with it and developing it, we decided that we needed to follow our own advice, take our own medicine, and center healing. And so we began calling it the integrative trauma and healing framework, with the realization that if we're going to talk about what happens after harm, we also need to talk about what happens before. There's this amazing 2009 TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, a Nigerian creative writer and essayist, called The Danger of a Single Story. And then there's this little mic drop moment from that talk, which I'm not going to read out loud, but that we will stitch in.
Stories too are defined by the principle of Nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes. The immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity.
See what I mean? This is a really great TED Talk. Highly recommend. We'll link it in the show notes. And I want to highlight what she says here, that the danger of a single story is literally that it robs people of their dignity as a people. We'll get more into interruptions and restorations of the four fundamentals later, but hold this in your heart, that the danger of a single story is that it is an assault on dignity. And in our framework, this is what makes it traumatic. And this is why we always start the clock with wholeness and not with harm, genocide, enslavement, or dehumanization.
It is with this idea of telling a story that starts with secondly that we want to ground this opening discussion about wholeness. Because one critique we have of the current broad, mainstream, or clinical definitions of trauma, which we'll talk more about shortly, is that they largely define trauma by its impacts, not by what causes it. They start with secondly. In a public health approach, when someone becomes sick, we try to tend to the impacts or the symptoms. But we also try to understand what caused it. How is it transmitted? Or how does illness differ when it's caused by a bacteria or a virus or a cancerous cell? Our limited explanations of what causes trauma range from unhelpfully vague to way too narrow. For instance, it's only trauma if you almost die or experience substantial bodily harm. We think that part of the struggle here is that trauma is actually quite pervasive and complex. It takes many forms, and it causes different kinds of impacts across different people. There are social and cultural contexts to how people experience and process trauma. So this framework is an attempt at a deeper understanding of this complexity and creating pathways to healing that operate in the individual, collective, systemic, intergenerational, and cultural layers. We need ways to talk about the root causes of trauma. Until we can address the root causes and cultivate healing across the layers, we will simply be tending to a revolving door of suffering rather than addressing what is causing that suffering in the first place. So, if the starting place is wholeness, what are these 4 fundamentals of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging that get interrupted in traumatic events and can be rebuilt to get whole again? Teddy?
Ready. So let's start with this idea of what a fundamental is as it relates to something being foundational, right? As in that upon which we build, which is a helpful way to think about this. We build a self on these fundamentals. When there are cracks in the foundation, the self can be shaky and more susceptible to getting knocked over or knocked down. The definition of safety that we use is that it's a sense of being physically, psychologically, emotionally secure, having all our basic needs met in ways that don't cause harm or rely on exploitation. And when talking about safety, we acknowledge that this word means different things to different people. And we acknowledge that there are different kinds of safety: physical, mental, emotional, financial, community, or spiritual. Safety means different things to different people, and yet all of us need it. Agency, it's our sense that we can act on our own behalf and make informed choices, and that we have some influence over our conditions. The definition that I most often use is from the Northwest Network for LGBT Survivors of Abuse, and it has 3 components. It's the ability to make a decision, experience reasonable consequences for that decision, and then make another decision. And if we don't have all 3 of those components, then our agency is necessarily compromised. When we talk about dignity, we define it as our sense of power and worthiness that's not based on harm or dehumanization. It's our intrinsic self-worth. And having dignity doesn't equate to thinking that we're perfect or better than other folks or don't have places to grow. It's quite the opposite. It shows us that we can be imperfect and make mistakes and still be worthy of love and belonging. And it's a birthright. It's not a thing that we have to earn or acquire. It's innate. And lastly, belonging, which we define as being a full member of a group, being in meaningful relationships with people, planet, spirit, and other living beings. Belonging is the container here for connection, for relationships and love. And while we present these 4 fundamentals as a set of 4, occasionally belonging shows up as maybe the most fundamental, or at least the one that I want to dedicate most of my time to. We know that we can't thrive without connection, that we literally can't mature into adult humans without the care of other humans for the first, 5-10 years of our lives. We're hardwired to survive by belonging to a group. And the story of belonging that I most often share with folks is from a retreat that I went to several years ago. My partner was finishing her PhD and in full dissertation mode. And we had 2 children under 5 at home at the time. And so one of the ways that I was tending to my relative well-being was that I would go to spiritual retreats with my local Buddhist community. And this one in particular was a half-day retreat, and it was in town. So I didn't really have to travel far for it, which was good because I had forgotten about it because I was already doing the most. And when my partner pointed out that wasn't that thing today, it was already 30 minutes after it was supposed to begin. We were able to course correct, and she made space for me to go. So I show up at this retreat center. I'm already 45 minutes late. I'm standing at the door, and all the feelings of shame, of how I'm going to walk in late, and they're going to look down on me, and there's going to be a record scratch and all the things. But I also knew it was something I really needed. So I took a breath, and I walked into the spot. And as I'm walking up the stairs, I literally hear singing. And so I walk in, and there are snacks on the table. There's a place for me to put my coat. And then there's a cushion in the circle with the song notes right in front of it. There was no record scratch. There were no dirty looks. They actually didn't break stride or note at all. They just invited me to my spot and welcomed me right in. And I can't emphasize enough how much that mattered. That I had everything I needed to fully participate and engage, that I was welcomed without shame, and there was a space that was just for me. And for folks who have had those moments or been in those places, just breathe that in for a moment. Like, that is what we mean when we talk about belonging and how essential that is for us herd humans.
So now we're going to pivot to discussing some of the existing definitions of trauma and how this framework dances with those definitions. Specifically, we're going to talk about the one from SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the World Health Organization, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, otherwise known as the DSM-5. A couple of other current references as well, because we really want to be thorough here. It's an important conversation. So, the first thing we want to say again up front is that we don't think these existing definitions are wrong. Okay, maybe we think that some of them are more wrong than others, but we do believe they're incomplete. We just found consistently in social work practice that they didn't offer adequate strategies to cope with or integrate or heal from the impacts of trauma. So we're going to start with the DSM-5, dun dun dun, and what it says about trauma. But I want to offer a caveat right off the bat that the DSM has some issues. Generally speaking, it was definitely not created for regular folks to use in any meaningful way. It was created for use by psychiatrists and clinicians to diagnose mental health disorders, and it comes completely from the medical model, right? And our reliance on diagnosis is also very connected to healthcare and health insurance and the way that we provide, or frankly don't provide, healthcare in the United States. And it is because of, not in spite of that it is part of the conversation here. So the DSM-5 definition of trauma requires, quote, actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, end quote. Stressful events not involving an immediate threat to life or physical injury, such as psychosocial stressors, are not considered trauma in this definition. This definition is very, very limited in our opinion, and I know many people who've experienced trauma that would not meet this definition. For instance, if you have a parent or a partner who frequently says hateful or demeaning things, that can be very traumatic, but would likely not meet this definition. Experiences like homelessness or witnessing violence also don't meet this definition and definitely can cause trauma. So the World Health Organization, or WHO, is an international public health agency, and they define trauma as, quote, a delayed or protracted response to a stressful event or situation, either short or long-lasting, of an exceptionally threatening or long-lasting nature, which is likely to cause pervasive distress in almost anyone, end quote. This definition from the WHO gets a little closer to what trauma is, but it still focuses on the, quote, response to a stressful event or situation. As with the other definition, it starts with secondly. It doesn't define what is occurring that causes that response. We define trauma as the harmful interruption of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. There are, of course, many, many other wise people who have talked about, mused, and written about trauma, different kinds of trauma, different aspects of trauma. In addition to the folks we've mentioned so far, I'm a fan of Dan Segal's metaphor of, quote, flipping the lid to describe what happens in the body-brain when someone's having a trauma or threat response. I'm grateful for the indigenous teaching and scholarship on historical trauma. We've also drawn heavily from the fields of transformative justice, epigenetics, somatic theories, and a range of body-brain related work like How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett. We've linked to this and other additional references in the show notes. But we're going to finish this section talking a little bit about SAMHSA.
The SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is a federal agency under the Department of Health and Human Services. And they define trauma like this. They say that, quote, trauma can be a life-changing experience. Traumatic events can happen at any age, to any person. It may affect an individual's daily life and cause long-lasting harm to the individual's physical and mental health and well-being. Traumatic events may be experienced by an individual, a generation, or an entire community or culture. That trauma recovery and healing is possible through appropriate and adequate support at the individual, family, and community levels. That's an updated definition, and it's better than a lot of them out there because it does actually include that it can happen at the family and community level and that there are kind of cultural pieces. I want to say about the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration that it was established by Congress in 1992 to lead public health efforts to advance behavioral health of the nation. And early on, the agency set out to provide guidance on trauma-informed practice and took this kind of grounded theory-building approach, which means they literally took what survivors said and then refined it to help organizations be more trauma-informed and less traumatizing to their clients and users. And the SAMHSA principles, the SAMHSA 6 as we call them, that guide trauma-informed practice are safety, trustworthy and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. For those of you who can count, that was more than 6, but they snuck them in, and I'm here for it. So last year, we were super excited to see this new resource that SAMHSA put out that depicts trauma occurring at various levels, at the individual, family, and group trauma, cultural, racial, and historical, and mass trauma. And at the level of federal public health, this is one of the first acknowledgments that trauma affects groups of people, collectives, families, communities, and entire cultures, which is a huge step forward in beginning to understand the depth and breadth of trauma. So shout out to SAMHSA, you're doing great work. And yet, I'd like to share the first of 2 general problems with most of these and other definitions. First, they stop short of defining what trauma is, and again, rely on defining trauma by its impact. We know that trauma is pervasive and takes many forms, that trauma can feel like a massive explosion or fracturing in a person's life that happens all at once, or that trauma can happen as a result of a slow erosion of our safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. We know that some trauma happens to us personally, and other trauma we experience vicariously and occurs from witnessing the trauma and exploitation of others, people, animals, and the planet itself. But trauma is the erosion, the explosion, the fracturing, the cleaving of these fundamentals. The trauma response or reaction is everything that happens as a result of those. And because our behavioral health world is generally oriented toward that medical model of diagnosis and treatment, the approach to trauma has followed suit. It tends to be reductionist and primarily focused on how to cure or treat a particular trauma symptom.
So, issue 1, trauma is typically defined by its impacts, not by what causes it. The second issue we have with these definitions is that the main focus of trauma occurs at the level of the individual. Again, with a nod to SAMHSA for the ecological model. We love that. This, perhaps more than anything, was what drove me to find different ways to understand trauma, because I saw every day that there was something additional, something different that happened around trauma that occurred in groups, within systems and generations, and across cultures. Typically, in the Western medicalized model, we talk about individual people having individual traumatic experiences using primarily individual interventions or responses to address trauma. Of course, there is a small amount of group therapy, healing communities like AA or NA, and spiritual group practices that also exist. However, by and large, we focus at the individual level. In the social work program that I teach in, over 80% of people are coming to that social work program to prepare to be individual therapists. And therapy is certainly one pathway to healing. I'm here for it. I love therapists. Therapist is great. But we simply can't or won't be able to therapize our way out of lots of kinds of trauma. And while I'm a huge proponent of more group work, mutual aid, and peer counseling, it's more than that too. We believe that collective trauma must also be healed in families, groups, and communities, and that systemic trauma must be addressed in part through systemic transformation towards healing justice, and that intergenerational trauma requires healing within families and interrupting the transmission of trauma to future generations. And historical trauma must be addressed through explicit acknowledgement, reparation, and ultimately cultural transformation. So thinking back to our attempts to help Seattle Public Schools, if we use the medical model and we, quote, treat everyone only at the individual level, that won't increase our collective safety. If policies or conditions affecting kids in schools are not addressed, it won't rebuild our fundamentals or create more just and equitable systems. We didn't sit down at that school and diagnose kids. We thought about them in the environments they were actually living in. We mapped out their connections because relationship is the intervention. In the words of Alexander de Hager, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. I have this long-standing relationship with the statement, I'm willing to believe something else is possible. It's actually painted on this little card that's hung in my office. I found it in a bookshop in Berkeley, California years ago, and it's this little fish, and it's a watercolor, and it's got like glitter on it, and it's, the fishbowl is knocked over and it's flowing out, and underneath it says, I'm willing to believe something else is possible. It's my commitment and my rally cry. It grounds me and it challenges me. And I've spent a lot of time since that walk in the park with Teddy thinking about what else is possible for understanding trauma, being with trauma, bearing witness to trauma, and ultimately doing our best in the time we have to heal trauma. Like, what if we had a shared understanding of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging? And just talking about these fundamentals was part of our everyday experience. What if when someone experienced something traumatic, we could talk about it in terms of losing access to these fundamentals, having them taken away, or having to hustle or trade for one fundamental in order to survive? How can we think deeply about rebuilding those fundamentals across the different layers? What could it look like to increase safety, agency, dignity, and belonging within systems, politics, or across our cultures? There are so many examples, and we have some ideas. And we'll dig into those in future episodes. But for now, we're going to head into our final segment.
Thanks, Leslie. I don't want to leave y'all hanging, so I'm going to share a little bit of what happened with that school that we got to hang out with in the way back. And one of the things that they came to, that they decided to do as a school, and particularly as a staff, was that they actually went into their gym and they put up the name of every kid in their school all around the gym. And underneath each of those names, they put the name of a teacher or an adult at that school who had a positive relationship with that kid. It was really quick for them to visually notice who were the kids who were most vulnerable. They were the kids who had the fewest connections to caring adults in that building and in that school. And so those are the ones who they made sure that they reached out to and that they connected with, because belonging is the thing that keeps us safe, right? Because relationship is the intervention. And so again, like Leslie was saying, it wasn't, let's sit down with each of these individuals and make sure that they have all their assets or whatever. It was, how do we make sure that this entire community is healthy enough to hold all these young people who had already been kicked out of their home school, right? Like, that was the thing that they most needed. And they kept those kids safe for the rest of that year. Okay. So final segment. As we said in the opening, we intend for the framework to be understandable, applicable, and responsive to people's lived lives. And so in each episode, we're going to close by doing two things. First, by offering a practice for folks who are interested in putting ideas into action in their own lives. And second, some sort of individual exercise. Today it's going to be a breathing to settle us in a little before we head back out into the world. So for this episode, we invite listeners to spend some dedicated time reflecting on one of the areas in your life. It could be your family, your work, your school, a social, civic, or spiritual group, just a space where you're part of a group of people. And notice, investigate, get curious about, how does this group take care of these fundamentals? How does it take care of our safety, our agency? How does it support our dignity and our belonging? Are there specific people who tend to any one or more of the four? How are they doing that? What does it look like? Am I one of those people? How does the absence or lack of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging feel to you in that space? And finally, how does the presence of safety, agency, dignity, and belonging feel to you? How do they feel in your body, in your emotions or sensations? How do you experience them in your thoughts and behaviors and relationships? So now you have that to sit with, if you so choose. But I'll close this out with a little breathing.
We love the breathing part.
Yeah, if you're operating heavy machinery, don't do this right now. Save it and come back to it later. But I will offer this little practice for y'all. We're going to breathe into the four chambers of our heart, along with each of our fundamentals. So you might want to rest your feet firmly on the floor. You might want to get yourself a little comfortable. I always give myself a little wiggle, make sure I'm kind of in the center where I want to be. And I'm inviting you to visualize the breath, your blood, energy, attention, intention, going into one of those chambers of your heart and filling it with that fundamental. And with the out-breath, it travels all throughout the body, through the tens of thousands of miles of veins and capillaries in your body. So we might breathe in belonging and feel it suffuse all of our cells. We can breathe in safety and feel it settle into our entire body. We can breathe in agency, feel the impetus to move. and we can breathe in dignity and shake off anything that says that we're not worthy. Awesome. Thank you all so much for listening. This is a labor of love, so thanks for affirming our labors in this. If you're interested in more, please check out wholeagainpod.com, where you can find transcripts, show notes, additional practice prompts. It's also a place where you can reach out to us if you're interested in learning more. We're putting this out free to the universe in the hope that it finds folks and folks find it helpful. So if that's you, please pass it along to someone else who might benefit from it. And for those of you interested in supporting the show financially, we'll have a Patreon that goes directly to defraying the costs of recording and sound mixing and all that good stuff. Shout out to NAS Studios and our engineer, Blake. Shout out to producer Sylvia of Has Everything & Co. Shout out to the land, these lands of the Duwamish. And we out.
Thanks, everybody.